Hello everybody and welcome back to What's Jay Reading, home of the old, the obscure, and the bizarre. I am, obviously, Jay, with a brand new selection of stories, so sit back and relax. The dichotomy between good and evil is one of the foundational elements of storytelling, and one well worn in the comic medium. Hero, villain, both, neither, some unholy amalgamation therein, the forces of order and chaos are arrayed in a wide tapestry across the many superpowered forces that dwell in this medium. The most recent bend to this, and one already significantly overrepresented, is the fallen hero, a mighty force for good falling to corruption and becoming that which was they swore to fight. Evil Superman has become what was once a great hypothetical argument for the nature of the hero mentality, into yet another marketing gimmick for a lazy writer to capitalize on with minimal effort needed to build a proper narrative. Even independent or original stories seem to fall back on this at some point or another. And while there are certainly better examples than others, it is a very saturated market. But what about the other side of the coin? What about taking the vilest of the vile, the criminal scum of the world, and raising them up to stand alongside the greats of the great? It's an idea with barely any exploration, serious or otherwise, and leaves a great deal of space for utilization. And hell, why not do both at once in one big setting? This very idea is the premise of the two series that I'm putting a spotlight on today. The idea of doing a role reversal for both superhero and villain. The first of two series is Irredeemable, the story of Earth's greatest hero finally breaking and taking the world with him in his rage. Beginning in April of 2009 and wrapping at 37 issues in May of 2012, Irredeemable follows the world of the Plutonian, Earth's mightiest hero and leader of the super team, the Paradigm. Once adored and respected the world over, the Plutonian has finally snapped under the stress and pressure of his role as titanic protector of justice, and instead takes the mantle of world's greatest supervillain. Now on an unstoppable and unquenchable tour of destruction across the world, slaughtering all those who could have had a chance to stop him, and making the people of Earth cower in terror before him, the remaining members of the Paradigm he hasn't already wiped out must band together to try and find any desperate way to stop the Plutonian, and put the fragments of the world back in one piece. But alongside this, we had the opposite spectrum of things with Incorruptible, the story of Earth's greatest villain, trying his hardest to step into the mantle of world's greatest hero. Incorruptible ran concurrently with Irredeemable, starting in December of 2009 and ending at the same time for a total of 30 issues. Incorruptible follows the exploits of the rather embarrassingly named Max Damage, regarded as being the world's most evil villain and wanted for just about any and every crime you could conceivably commit. Before the Plutonian's fall, Max was just about the worst person who ever existed. With zero regard for anyone or anything beyond his own short-term amusement, there was no level too low and no act too vile for Max to engage with. But that was before the Plutonian fell, before the game of hero and villain was irreversibly brought to an end. In this new and broken world, Max has emerged from the chaos a changed man, and seeks to make amends for his massive list of crimes by taking on the role as Earth's greatest superhero. Unfortunately for everyone, Max is rather quite bad at the whole do-gooding thing. Both series were brought to us by veteran writer Mark Waid, very much playing against the type he's largely cast in by fans. As detailed by Waid in a few interviews, and compounded in an afterword by famous lunatic Grant Morrison, the series is very much cast in the idea of reinventing oneself, casting off the image one had established and becoming a completely different person altogether, here far more drastically than the examples given. Alongside artists Peter Krause, Diego Barreto, and several more, Waid presents a tale of reinvention, not just for the stars of the book, but himself as well. Rather than simply do snippets of the two books, as I usually do, I'm going to give a general overview of both titles in full, though in less detail than I typically do. Naturally, of course, spoilers throughout. The best place to start would probably be our central characters, highlighting the differences yet similarities between them. And of course, we should start with the Plutonian. Plutonian, our resident Superman analog and predominant antagonist, is definitely more complex than you'd expect from initial presentation. While at first glance it does seem like it's going down the standard evil Superman route, taking advantage of everyone's trust and reliance on him to systematically dismantle each and every one of his former allies, gleefully destroying the world in a fit of rage to preside over the ruins as god and master. Indeed, this does make him a fairly intimidating threat for the series overall. A borderline omnipotent mad god who can hear and see you at all times, with no chance to ever reconcile with, ally with, or stop him. Who could and would obliterate your entire existence in a second, and your only chance of survival being the hope you escape his notice for the time being. But once the series starts getting deeper into his character, it becomes more of an interesting portrayal of the evil Superman. While I wouldn't explicitly call Irredeemable a superhero deconstruction, at least not in the same way we typically consider them, one of the key things Waid sought for the story was breaking down an unspoken rule of superhero reality. That being the emotional fortitude to handle being a superhero. As Waid describes, the real Superman and other heroes work because they have the capability of handling the pressures of their roles and public personas, both the intense adulation and worship, or the critical mockery and scorn. They can operate detached from the opinions of the individual and simply work for the betterment of man, and that's what makes a superhero a superhero. Plutonian, and many of the other supers involved in the story, can't do that. And that's what makes him a unique take. He's fallible. He made careless mistakes, got mad at critics, and let the worship and reliance get to his head, creating a feedback loop when he realized this worship and criticism came from fear and inability to ever truly accept him. And even as the series goes on, we come to realize that he was never exactly all there in the head to begin with, bouncing from foster family to foster family as the reality of a superpowered child was too much for many to bear. Not helping things being his own human shortcomings, making it all worse. Even the events that led to his fall are a series of simple, careless mistakes that snowball into worse and worse scenarios, creating bigger and bigger problems that he simply can't just put into a box and toss away, and ultimately becoming too much to bear. And despite all of this and the more and more abhorrent things Plutonian engages in as the story goes on, he still ultimately wishes to just be able to put everything all back together and be the hero he used to be. A nice clean ending where everyone is happy. While his rampage ultimately does boil down to a gigantic tantrum leveled against the people he once stood along, it's these details that makes Plutonian more complex than what if le Superman but le evil? And the humanization of him throughout these elements made his depravity all the more interesting to watch. It helps that despite all of his insane wishing that he could just go back to normal in his mind, he's basically just given up any hope in it in reality and never engages in anything remotely resembling wide-scale redemption up until the very, very end. Max, on the other hand, is a little less complex deep down, but this simplicity is actually to his benefit. His origins and motive are hardly as complicated as Plutonian, a troubled teen who fell into crime and eventually grew to his heights as a karmic foil to the mighty hero, but this more human origin is what makes his fall and attempts to climb back up a work in comparison. First and foremost, I like that Max's turn to heroics is entirely genuine and not a work. Many times, in this scenario, it inevitably turns out to be nothing more than an elaborate scheme against the heroes, but not here. As Max himself says, with the Plutonian fallen, the game of supers is over, and someone needs to fill the place of law and order. And the sheer shock and horror he's seen has convinced him to be the one to fill that place. The angle is engaging, and I like the setup of him having been a depraved villain for so long he literally doesn't know the first thing about being good. Thinking the solution to heroics is, think of what I'd usually do, and then do the opposite. Which the series utilizes well for both comedic and dramatic potential. I also like how well Max sticks to his new demeanor, ironically having a stronger moral fortitude than the heroes in many cases. Despite all the, incredibly well-deserved, criticism and complete lack of trust Max deals with, he never breaks his new role or caves into any old desires, sticking to his convictions no matter how badly people treat him or how bad things get, and only ever breaking right near the end when he's finally hit his limit. I also think his power set is probably the most unique out of the entire cast. On paper, he's got your standard super strength, super speed, invincibility, etc. combo. The unique element is how it's gained. Max's strength is proportional to how long he's stayed awake, growing more and more with every passing hour. The caveat is that his strength resets whenever he sleeps, and the one thing he's not immune to is sleep deprivation. Eventually, no matter how hard he tries, he eventually has to sleep and reset his strength. This too is played with both comedically and dramatically, more the former than the latter, and it adds an interesting bend to Max as a character as well, thematically tying him with Plutonian with the more realistic bend to the standard super arsenal, and the drawbacks certain powers would bring someone. While Plutonian and Max are the central figures of the two narratives, the framing isn't identical between books. While Incorruptible does largely focus on Max's POV, Irredeemable mostly puts Plutonian in the background for large majorities, with the story being told from the perspective of the Paradigm, the resident superhero conglomerate, and their desperate attempts at putting their former leader down to protect the world from his rampage. The team has some solid variety in terms of personalities, and Waid builds the characters strongly right from the start. You can immediately see there's years of richly built relationships just off panel. Never at any point does it feel like the story needs to stop to explain these details in depth, giving just enough for the reader to infer on their own. Individually, however, much of the team doesn't stand out. While their interpersonal relationships between the team, or those outside it, provide some sizable weight, many of the team fall into standard popular hero copy archetypes, like a lot of these stories do, and just sort of fade into the background, not making it all that worth it when someone gets killed off over the course of the story. Now, I wouldn't say I really hate any of the Paradigm. Each one gets at least one good moment to flesh them out, and, as I said earlier, no one feels that much similar to another. And these are all engaging, be it a more drawn-out dramatic affair, like the unraveling marital crisis between Bete Noir and Gilgamos, the obligatory Black Widow and Thor/Hawkman parodies, or a shorter one-off like Volt's flashback poking fun at the usual stereotypes of black superheroes. But in many cases, once these story moments wrap, they tend to fade back into the ensemble, and even with them staying around to the end, they tend to just feel like they exist. Out of the lot, the one who gets arguably the most focus, Cubit, is a surprisingly endearing character despite his numerous flaws. Ostensibly, he's the real protagonist of the story. From the start, he's got some nice layers of complexity. While he's rude, standoffish, and definitely very amoral in his actions, he's got the strongest conviction of the group, and is the only one who still truly believes there's a way to end the Plutonian's rampage without having to kill him, or worse. It's this combination of amorality and genuine compassion that puts him in a unique position to serve as a perfect foil for just about everyone. Never willing to compromise or cross lines he swore not to, regardless of how miserable things get, even if it means sabotaging the others to do so. It creates a nice contrast between him and the others, especially with the team's self-appointed replacement leader, Charybdis, or Carrie, or Survivor, or whatever he wants to fucking call himself. Carrie's also interesting as well, starting off as a duo team with his twin Scylla, whose tragic early death results in a significant power boost to Carrie, before taking on a position of authority. Carrie is a bit of an inverse of Cubit, as he's unwilling to spare Plutonian in any way, shape, or form, but is more than willing to stoop lower and lower to achieve it. He's a good mirror of Plutonian's own downfall, as his newfound power and lust for revenge almost immediately sends him spiraling down the slippery slope to Crazyville, further emphasizing the themes of the story. Inversely, Incorruptible's supporting cast is significantly smaller than its companion piece, but with that smaller cast comes a tighter narrative. Most major is Lieutenant Armadale, a cop in Max's hometown who's willingly accepted to help teach Max what it means to be a good guy, largely because who the hell else does he have to ask? I like Armadale a lot as a moral compass for Max. Though he gives him his fair share of teasing and criticism, especially early on, it's pretty clear that Max respects him nonetheless, and as Max continues to prove himself in cleaning up his act, he begins to show him otherwise, but, as is the case with most of the cast, never really truly accepting Max's story of going straight. It helps that the two have very similar situations, and Armadale may see a lot of his own path in life in Max, and he projects his own failures back onto his attempts. Armadale's personal narrative is built very offhandedly, only told in brief background snippets or offhand remarks as the story goes on, and while I wouldn't call it subtly built, it's kept realistic and engaging, and makes him a very compelling character throughout. Next up is his second major supporting character, his former villainous sidekick and ex-girlfriend, Jailbait. Yes, I'm serious. Who mostly serves as a leash to his former life. Refusing to buy his redemption, she clings to their criminal past and attempts to drag Max back down to his old ways, much to his annoyance. A clear pastiche of the Harley Quinn archetype, for lack of an easier explanation, the two's relationship is something of an inverse of the mold. Rather than being the one trying to escape her villainous roots and former boyfriend, it's the other way around, and she's still hopelessly obsessed with him and beating criminals. She's really just kind of irritated, mostly getting Max's way or sabotaging his work, usually by accident mind you, and hurting his standing in the eyes of others. Very rarely does anything she say or do add anything significant, and her role as a temptation to give in to Max's demons falls flat since he basically outright ignores anything she tries. The double meaning of her name is definitely deliberate, and the way their relationship is portrayed is rather odd, but weirdly enjoyable. It helps that they don't go too much into detail, and besides the, how shall we say, unfortunate implications that go along with it, they never imply anything too negative. Ultimately, though, her purpose is pretty minimal, as she just outright leaves the story relatively early on, effectively disappearing between issues and doesn't return until very close to the end. Her role, instead, gets usurped by a girl named Annie. Initially dragged into Max's war on crime as an unfortunate decoy in an elaborate scheme, Annie finds herself taking on the role as his sidekick on a permanent basis after her family is killed, diving deeper and deeper into the role and losing herself in an ever-growing obsession with Max. I like Annie more as a foil. She again shows the overall moral of the main book, in that the relative ease one takes on the role of superhero is generally taken for granted. The way her and Max's relationship develops as it progresses is also really nice, showing Max is weary but accepting of her aid at the start, and his increasing sorrow as he sees her fall deeper and deeper into her despair, increasingly treating the role as a bigger and bigger crutch to avoid dealing with the trauma of her reality. A very common factor in superhero books, it's laid out flat here and actually grows fairly organically with her sanity decreasing in a realistic fashion, rather than a full-on 180 happening, and Max's continued begrudging acceptance of her as she worsens, treated as a negative factor by everyone. Fortunately, even he realizes the mistake in it as much as he keeps condoning it. Again, none of it is exactly subtle, but I do rather enjoy it as an overall take on sidekicks in general. Last of Max's primary cast is Alana. Formerly the Plutonian's Lois Lane copy, Alana showed up briefly in the main book to help flesh out the fall of the great hero, before reappearing midway through Max's book as the victim of some bizarre white supremacy gang / Plutonian cult thing Max fights. Despite their colorful history and her own traumas from superpowered individuals, Alana fully believes in Max's crusade, and wholeheartedly puts her support into it. From here, she acts as something of a manager for Max, trying her hardest to steer his ideas into more meaningful tangents. Alana works as a good foil for Max, her own flaws and weaknesses playing with Max's to compare and contrast the two. Much of her personal arc has to deal with her own trust issues, showing the stressful reality of being a normal so close to supers, and how badly it's been for her. But it's these same trust issues that only lead to further problems, not just for herself, but those around her. Indeed, it's shown rather subtly early on, but as the story continues, Alana's stress creates something of a loop, frequently revealing sensitive information on those around her on a casual basis, thereby spurring distrust and worsening relationships, feeding the stress more, and so on and so forth. And this weirdly human angle is actually really good, with long-lasting consequences that aren't simply brushed aside when it fits the story. Really through it all, she has quite a great in common with Max at her heart, for better or worse, and this is really what makes the two play off each other so well. The two narratives, despite sharing the same universe, largely stand on their own, though Incorruptible is often influenced by events that occur in Irredeemable, but not the other way around. Structurally, they follow a similar beat, generally segmented into shorter acts of about 4 issues or so. However, this is relatively loose in its use. Irredeemable largely keeps to a consistent serious tone with the flow of the story, the abject horror of the scenario played straight, and even the more overt satirizing of superhero settings doesn't detract from the mood. Not that there aren't jokes or moments of levity, of which there is a sizable chunk of throughout, but this is used sparingly to lighten up the book during downtime. I say downtime, but that isn't quite accurate, as there's never a point where the story slows or stops. From beginning to end, the series is constantly at a breakneck pace, each and every issue a new shocking moment, a new twist, a new startling cliffhanger, and beyond. Shock betrayals, stunning secrets revealed, surprise deaths, surprise returns, and so much more keep the story pumping at max speed throughout. And in the early parts of the series, it's absolutely amazing. It keeps you thinking that anything at all could possibly happen, that there's no limits to where it can go. Be it shocking reveals about the Plutonian's greatest enemy, or Carrie making pacts with literal demons, every issue changes the playing field of the universe in an unpredictable way that keeps the tension ramped up. However, it's this exact nature that, while benefiting the series in the early run, ultimately proves to be its biggest, most fatal flaw in the long term. It doesn't ever stop. It never lets up. There's always a new twist or cliffhanger. It very quickly reaches a point where there's shocking climax after shocking climax or twist after twist that just fatigues the reader emotionally, as with no time to rest, there's no time to stop and think about what's going on. This constant need for a new twist or a new change to the narrative creates a rather noxious loop the series falls into, where we're introduced to some new shocking secret about Plutonian, or one of the heroes or what have you, that now that we know about it, that's an absolute game changer. There will be betrayal, disagreement, friendships, and romances burned or destroyed, all of which to finally put aside in the end as this new important reveal for sure shall finally be what we need to stop Plutonian and oh, okay, never mind, it didn't work. Oops. This exact beat repeats several times across the comic's run, and each and every time it hypes itself up more and more, only to fall apart the exact same, becoming more and more and more exhausting each time. And with the cast slowly depleting as the book goes on, more and more losses as the Plutonian rampages once more, the reader just ultimately becomes dumb and apathetic to what's going on. It becomes increasingly clear that this breakneck nature of the narrative was all to hide the reality that Waid simply did not have the story planned out in advance. And this isn't speculation, he's been upfront about Irredeemable not having a set length or ending in mind from the start. And there isn't anything inherently wrong with this strategy, but combined with the intense narrative flow, it leaves the writer with too many chances to crash and burn. The absolute worst of it comes about halfway in, when Earth is visited by the alien armada the Vespa, established in a flashback as former enemies of the Paradigm that the Hornet, the resident Batman analog, made a secret pact with as a long-term strategy to stop Plutonian should this scenario occur, who make good on their promise by soundly defeating him, imprisoning him with no chance of escape, and immediately fucking off from Earth. While a good, if ultimately ambiguous ending for the story, the problem is that it isn't the ending. The book keeps going on from here, and leads into a gigantic chunk of the story left with the problem of, well, now what? And almost unsurprisingly, more and more shit just keeps happening to allow Plutonian to eventually, some fucking how, get back to Earth more pissed than before, making the whole exercise a waste of time when you stop and think about it. And the moment-to-moment stuff is still fine, for sure, but that doesn't magically make the overall story better by any means. While Incorruptible has a similar setup to its companion book, it's largely saved from the same fate that befalls it for a few key reasons. To start with, as Incorruptible lacks an explicit and endgame goal as Irredeemable, the individual arcs don't have a specific point to aim for, therefore keeping it from falling into the same loop of new shocking reveal, build up to conclusion, have it fail, begin again, as before. Though it does still use the same general issue-to-issue style of twist upon twist upon twist, the book allows itself moments of rest to actually properly ruminate on what's going on. And this is aided by the fact that Incorruptible is overall just lower stakes than Irredeemable is. While not to say that what's happening is unimportant, Max's goals and individual problems are much lower on the food chain than stopping the subjugation and extinction of humanity, so even when it does fall into the same traps as Irredeemable, it's far less exhausting when it occurs. Both books narratively largely serve to comment and critique on the ways people react in crises, with Irredeemable focused more on the interpersonal problems, whereas Incorruptible focuses on the societal and broader scale problems. This keeps the narratives more in flux, as focusing on the wider setting gives more opportunity to explore, and preventing the same overbearing tone from wearing down the reader. There's also a bit of a classism angle to it, as a good majority of the antagonists Max deals with are generally wealthy people in positions of power, hoarding and exploiting their fortunes to seize control and manipulate in these troubling times. For me though, what makes Incorruptible hold together better than Irredeemable is largely due to the problems it presents being largely unimportant. While again, not to say the threats Max deals with are totally irrelevant or aren't taken seriously, even the biggest problems he faces ultimately pale in comparison to the battle for the fate of the entire world the Paradigm deal with. Each has their own distinct flavors of evil, be it cartoonish white supremacy or your standard white-collar billionaire manipulation, but an interesting consistent element is that just about every antagonistic force Max deals with all share a similar theme. The exploitation of the less fortunate in times of trouble, the rich and powerful, literally in this book's case, doing everything they can to keep their status in the darkest of days. It creates a nice through line for the narrative, and I like the way it's handled where it's hardly called attention to. You only really notice it if you stop and look at the book overall. And helping it out is that Max largely doesn't really care all that much about the circumstances beyond it personally affecting him, which both greatly reflects his character and progression, while also keeping it from coming off as Waid turning the book into a soapbox. This irrelevance is further aided by allowing the book to take itself less seriously. cracking jokes and more overtly poking fun at the circumstances of the setting or the narrative. This gives the reader some much needed time to stop and breathe when things are getting intense. Doubly welcomed if you're switching between the two books issue by issue. Again, not that it never takes itself seriously in any fashion, quite a significant amount of the story is told straight, but the lower scale focus grants it the ability to unwind and have some fun without clashing heavily. The art is one of the only features not wholly consistent in both books. As mentioned above, while both books have artists that work on sizable portions of the two, no single artist works on one series for its entire run, and neither book ever shares an artist at any point. Despite this, there's a strong consistency in the visual language between the two. Both books have the same muted color palette, with a nice blend of tones across the spectrum, creating a diverse yet fittingly grim look and keeps the cartoony superheroics a bit more serious. The different artists have their own unique spins on the cast and their appearances, but the characters are still recognizable throughout. And every character, costume or no, has a look that easily tells you their personality before even reading their dialogue. The actual quality therein dips, of course, from artist to artist, and there's a few too many to break down all at once, but I definitely prefer some over others, and certain styles are better suited for the tones of the respective titles. Overall, though, the art is consistently competent. No particular glaring issues with any one artist's work beyond personal preference. Both individually and as a whole, the Irredeemable duology is a flawed but still worthwhile experience. Irredeemable has many fundamental issues that keeps it from being truly great at what it sets out to do. While it certainly accomplishes what it sets out for on a base level, and I enjoy large parts of the book, it falls into too many pitfalls of its own making to keep me from giving it a solid recommendation. Incorruptible, meanwhile, is a vastly more enjoyable experience between the two. With a unique premise and almost irreverence for itself, it accomplishes the goal it sets out for with far less issue than its companion. But as it's so deeply connected to Irredeemable, I can't just say read one over the other. You truly need to read both simultaneously to get the full effect Waid aims for. And together, it does help cover the failings of the two, but not enough to fully redeem it, fittingly enough. While I don't think the two were quite as successful in reinventing Waid himself as he seemed to hope, the two do carry that theme deep into the core. Good or bad, idol or pariah, remembered or irrelevant, it's all across the books in a variety of ways, and there, at least, it accomplishes something well. That'll be all for me this time. I'll be back later with more of the bizarre tales forgotten by history, but for now, remember, it's better to die a hero than to live long enough to sell out and become a hack fraud.